Hello gentlemen, this is CS MGTOW. Just before this video starts, I'd like to encourage you to visit MGTOW Meme Wars, and the link to MGTOW Meme Wars is in the description bar. My friend over there, Alex Brown, runs a really excellent group, and it would be great if you took a look at the group with the view of signing up. I apologize for the delay between my last video and this. I've been extraordinarily busy with work, and I was motivated to develop this video after watching a video by Obito Senju, and this is a response and a kind of follow-up video, as it were. This is certainly not an attack video. I like Obito's work. I've been a long-time subscriber to his work, and I just think it's important for us to set the record straight with regards to this particular issue.
I am not a person who is going to be getting married formally, using the state as some form of medium between myself and between whatever woman I engage in a long-term relationship with. Even though that is true, I still have respect for those that are happily married and that have a so-called nuclear family, or at least something which is somewhat close to that. I do respect that, and I do realize that having a strong family unit is the backbone of any society which is inhabited by civilians such as ourselves, right? We cannot live in a society where you have chaos and entropy within the domestic environment. Right? This is not an adequate environment to raise children, whether they are male children or female children. You're only going to create more complications and problems with them along the road. That being said, I want to make it clear that, yes, I do believe that the family unit is important to society. I don't think that we would have come as far as we have, and if without the family unit, and I don't think that we would be capable of moving very much further if there are not some members of society that have strong families.
So, the family unit has been described as the building block of civilization by traditionalists, and even within the MGTOW community, the kind of sentiment that has been expressed by many is that of genuine sorrow for the breakdown of the family and a hope of its return after a repeal of no-fault divorce. And I've seen many a MGTOW lament the departure of the nuclear family, and it's usually expressed in the kind of comments section, and it goes along the lines that the modern iteration of marriage has been corrupted, but its previous incarnation was somehow a net good to society, a positive thing overall, because of the family unit that it had encapsulated. So I find this notion dangerous and actually incorrect as well. Firstly, of course, and this is of course the lesser issue, but it puts MGTOW firmly in the crosshairs, so to speak, when society is looking for a scapegoat for the breakdown of one of mankind's most cherished institutions, which is, marriage and 2.0 kids. And secondly, of course, it simply isn't grounded in reality. So the idea that the family is the building block of all human civilization and marriage as the foundation of the family is fundamentally flawed. Firstly, there is the obvious logical fallacy, which is the appeal to longevity. The idea that the family unit must be a good thing, since as far back as we've had records, people have married in one form or another. And secondly, we're confusing correlation with causation. Some of the authors and content producers within the manosphere have even gone as far as to equate the breakdown of the family with a collapse of civilization. And when one analyzes the data, I guess one can very quickly refute such a hyperbolic language and be dragged back to sobriety. So in this video, I really hope to put to bed once and for all the idea that we ought to mourn in any way, shape or form the breakdown of the family. And hopefully as we move forward as MGTOW, we also may want to stop equating the breakdown of the family with fatherlessness. And again, that's going to seem a little bit weird, but they're not actually the same thing. So what we had was a type of family unit and it's now being replaced by another type of family unit. Now, for sure, I'm not condoning single motherhood. It's certainly a very, very highly destructive phenomenon, not just because of the social problems that it creates, but also financially. Our civilization cannot afford to subsidize a large part, of our membership, as it were, to basically just breed kids. And the evidence for the destructive effects of single motherhood on our civilization is pretty legion. So that this video won't cover that evidence and data. There is, of course, far less data on single fatherhood because there are just simply, less single fathers, but they're not interchangeable. So an individual on their own deciding to have a child, there are very, very big differences in the outcomes depending on the gender. So the breakdown of the family is very, very destructive when, of course, you have single motherhood. But I'm going to show you with evidence in this video that single fatherhood is a very, very different phenomenon. So the first question we might ask, with evidence and data, of course, as opposed to falling back on the traditionalist notions of what ought to be, is to what extent is the family unit responsible for the development of our advanced industrial civilization or any of its progenitors? To do this, it's important to both define what we mean by civilization and how and why it develops, why some ethno-cultural groups or ways of behaving develop into full-blown civilizations, and others cease existence or become a small part of a larger whole. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines civilization as the condition that exists when people have developed effective ways of organizing a society and care about art, science, and that kind of thing. So civilization itself comes from the Latin word civis, meaning someone who lives in a town. You see, when people are civilized, they live in large, well-organized groups like towns or cities, not in small tribes or isolated family groups. So even when one analyzes the origin of the word, it's pretty clear that civilization featured unrelated persons coming together. However, a civilization is, of course, something more than a town. It's an advanced stage of organization. That means that it has laws, culture, a regular way of getting food, a consistent way of protecting people. Of course, most civilizations, one of the things they have in common is agriculture, a system of government, whether it's a monarchy or some kind of a parliamentary body. They speak a common language. They may have a shared religion. They teach their young the knowledge they need. All civilizations since the Sumerians and the Egyptians have had some kind of writing, you see, because writing lets people store and build up knowledge. So most civilizations have either met a pretty slow demise or were wiped out by natural disasters or invasion. And there is a very, very interesting article which forms about half of, the evidence that I'm going to be citing in this particular video. The title of the article is The Causes of Civilization, the Middle East by 4000 BC. It was written by a gentleman named Robert Guisepi, and I've put the the title of the article and the link to it in the description bar. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from the article. The author wrote that one reason that civilization first appeared in the Middle East was because agriculture had taken hold in the region. Over many centuries, agriculture had become more common and productive in the Middle East. It began to create the conditions for further inventions and innovation, including civilization. But the first civilization also required an additional set of stimuli. The new inventions and organizations that had taken shape around 4000 BC. Much time elapsed between the developments of agriculture and the rise of civilization in the Middle East and many other places. The successful agricultural communities that formed were based primarily on very localized production, which normally sustained a population despite recurrent disasters caused by bad weather or harvest problems. Localized agriculture did not consistently yield the kinds of surplus that would allow specializations among the population, and therefore did not generate civilization. And this issue, and this is just myself, inserting a comment here, this issue of specialization is incredibly important. And I'm going to be going into this a little bit later on to talk about the differences between the nuclear family and the extended family. So we're really, really going to analyze why is specialization so important for a civilization later on, and why actually the nuclear family simply doesn't measure up in terms of creating a civilization. So several factors flow together to create, and this is the author of the article speaking again, to create the unexpected developments of civilization. While the establishment of agriculture did not guarantee further change, it did ultimately contribute to change by encouraging new forms of social organization. Settled agriculture, as opposed to slash and burn varieties, usually implied some forms of property so that land could be identified as belonging to a family, a village, or a landlord. Only with property was there an incentive to introduce improvements, such as wells, irrigation measures, that could be monopolized by those who created them or left to their heirs. But property meant the need for new kinds of laws and enforcement mechanisms, which in turn implied more extensive governments. Here, agriculture could create some possibilities for trade and spur innovation, new kinds of regulations, and some government figures who could enforce them. And it's really no accident that the earliest civilizations arose along rivers and amid irrigation projects. Civilization in Mesopotamia and Egypt, where of course you have the great River Nile. So these civilizations involved not only a central fact of economic surplus, but also the ability to integrate tens, even hundreds of square miles along rivers. Regional coordination based first on irrigation needs could easily lead to other contracts, shared cultures including artistic styles and religious beliefs, economic contracts including trade, and common political institutions. So the first potter's wheel was invented around 6000 BC. It encouraged faster and higher quality ceramic pottery production, which facilitated food storage and improved the reliability of food supplies. Pottery production promoted the emergence of a group of specialized manufacturing workers who made pots in exchange for food produced by others. Gentlemen, civilization formed due to technological innovations developed entirely by men. Agriculture, irrigation allowed us to produce surplus food. This naturally became a time surplus, as we no longer spent our entire days chasing antelope. This time surplus was then used by men to develop innovative tools such as arrows, metal for more efficient hunting, and self-protection. Men then developed more efficient means with which to store foods. Because we started building homes, farms, and trading, we developed rudimentary laws to protect against violent expropriation of property and so on and so forth. So to the traditionalists out there, my question to you is this: what role did the family play here? That's right, none. Men are the building blocks of civilization, or to be more accurate, the male sex drive. In my previous video, I went into how monogamy and the ever so cherished family is a symptom of calorific scarcity. When calories are in short supply, people adopt very, very specific and now, it seems, predictable reproductive patterns. If the family is so important to the developments of civilization, like for example on the level of agriculture, we ought to see civilizational collapse when the family was eviscerated at the advent of no-fault divorce. On screen, we see the United States economic performance as measured by GDP since the 1960s. And again, part of me that studied a lot of Austrian economics over the last decade kind of is a little bit disturbed at using GDP as a measure of economic performance because of all of the inherent contradictions in GDP as a concept. However, it's the data that I had available. So, no-fault divorce was signed into law by Ronald Reagan when he was the governor of California in 1969. Look on screen right now. Has the US economy paused for breath since no-fault divorce, sucker punched the family? Well, no. We see decade after decade of unprecedented economic growth since the family was taken off the life support machine. In fact, I would go as far as hypothesizing that in the previous centuries, the family unit actually held humanity back, as the creative energies of men were diverted into, such tasks as mowing the lawn and putting up furniture shelves and heading to Sunday church to make sure that he had continued access to his wife's sexual services by being a good, upstanding member of citizen as it was measured by then. So now you see a different set of data on screen. When one compares the GDP in two other parts of the world with that of the USA, and specifically I'm referring here to Mexico and Sub-Saharan Africa, countries that can quite rightly be described, or I guess parts of the world, I mean Sub-Saharan Africa is a part of the world, but they can be quite rightly described as having a large emphasis on traditional marriages and family. And again, you'll notice they don't experience anything near the level of economic growth and performance of that of the United States. Now, of course, there are certainly other factors at play here, such as their political systems. But the question that one might ask is, can a society industrialize and then expand if the family unit has not collapsed? Is the family unit the biggest obstacle we have as a species to ending world hunger, for example? Now, of course, the poverty levels we see in Sub-Saharan Africa are not entirely due to the fact that, they haven't implemented no-fault divorce. No, I mean, of course, there are issues of natural resources, issues of, education, the lack of a middle class. So, there are lots and lots of issues. But I guess what I'm driving at here is that you didn't notice any difference in economic performance in the United States after the collapse of the family. If it was so important to the civilization we had, one would have noticed at least a pause for breath. What I would like to do is to focus our minds on what happens when males are set free to do what men do. We explore our surroundings, we innovate, we develop things. To allow us to properly see the extent to which the family unit is indeed responsible for this civilization, I would like you to imagine a scenario where food production is, let's say, decreased by a factor of, 90% due to some kind of a nationwide plague. Let's see how well our civilization survives that, or if we render our species unable to mine for metals. I'm sure you get the picture here. A lot of men were hurt when the family unit broke down. It was absolutely devastating emotionally and financially to those individual men. But for most of our species, life went on. On the other hand, if you remove food, electricity, petrochemicals, and a host of other technological innovations, people will most likely riot within hours and probably resort to cannibalism within a couple of days if food is turned off. Remove men and male inventions from this world, and humanity dies a very cruel and painful death. In fact, in the parts of the world where they still cling desperately to the last vestiges of the family, due to resource scarcity, I might add, these places are often the poorest, least desirable parts of the world that the proponents of the nuclear family would not visit, let alone live in. These individuals living in these parts of the world cling to these old ways because they have to. Women don't have better options. So they stick around. There's no welfare state. Childhood mortality is high. Resources are very, very hard to come by, and food is scarce. So as a result of no welfare states and high childhood mortality, people have lots and lots of children. Because when you grow older, if there's no welfare state, your children will then take that role of supporting you. At least that's how, the kind of unwritten social contract works in those parts of the world. Marriage and the family was a response by humanity to its environment. Even if we didn't have no-fault divorce, we may actually still have the men going their own way phenomenon, perhaps with a slightly different flavor. And the reason for this is that the family unit was the previously optimal arrangement to divert the male sex drive into overproduction relative to the needs of the individual male. What the man got out of it was an honorary title as the leader of his family. It was the golden, sticker on the chest that Barbarossa pointed out in his video. And the family unit helped ensure that women were cared for along with their children. When resources are scarce, women pair up with men for the purposes of ensuring that their children and they are provided for. When resources are abundant, women will no longer go through the inconvenience of trading sex for money. They can be far more selective about who they choose to have sex with or who they choose to reproduce with. So the family unit, it seems, cannot survive civilization and mechanization. When we extended the vote to women and they could vote themselves free stuff, paid for by their fellow citizens, the family unit was dead on its feet. It wasn't dead on its feet simply because they were extended the vote. It's a slightly more complex mechanism. Society became wealthy enough that we started to care about the fact that half the population were politically disenfranchised. And then, of course, they voted themselves free stuff, but the act of extending them the vote itself wasn't the nail in the coffin of the family unit. It's because we just became really, really wealthy as a civilization. Another thing of real importance is the male need to assure paternity. The family provided the individual male relative safety. He could keep his reproductive property, his wife, away from the eyes and touch of other men through his family and household. Deep within the male is a need to ensure that the offspring that he expends very, very precious and scarce energy and resources on is indeed genetically his. The family helped men here to a limited extent. As long as she was under his constant watchful gaze, she couldn't easily cuckold him. When we critically look at what went into the developments of civilization, the family unit had nothing to do with it. In the same way that heat is a byproduct of friction, civilization is a byproduct of the male sex drive. The family unit was and always will be a means to an end, one that has outlived its usefulness for our species in the mechanized parts of the world. The extended family, which predates the nuclear family, actually played a far bigger role, and not for the reasons one might suppose. You see, the extended family was important due to the division of labor, the ability to specialize. That's why the extended family was actually a far more important and successful vehicle for promoting civilization. It didn't create civilization, but it may have promoted certain factors that led to civilization. And the second reason for the importance of the extended family is the ability to better resist predation and armed aggression from strangers. So if you have an extended family made up of 20 or 30 persons living close by, they're less likely to get robbed. And so the extended family was important for these reasons, as opposed to the familial bonds between its members, in the same way that guilds or business partnerships often flourish while sole traders struggle on for years. What we are doing here, gentlemen, is that we're confusing what caused civilization with what came along for the ride. The male sex drive caused civilization, and women and children enjoyed the benefits. One common argument for upholding the family is, who will look after the children? And emerging evidence really, really does suggest that you do not need families to raise children. Again, I'm not advocating single mother households. They are, have been, and will always likely will be an absolute monstrosity. However, due to the ninefold increase since 1960 of single father households, we're now seeing data emerge on outcomes in single father households versus single mother households. And a very, very interesting article here titled The Rise of Single Fathers by Gretchen Livingston of the Pew Research Center stated that there are some notable differences between single mothers and single fathers. And again, the hyperlink to this article is in the description bar. Single fathers on average have higher incomes than single mothers and are far less likely to be living at or below the poverty line. And again, you see the data on the screen. 24% of single fathers live below the poverty line, so just under a quarter, versus 43% of single mothers living below the poverty line, just under half. That these are very, very large differences in outcomes. And one might add that this is despite the barrage of welfare programs aimed at helping single mothers. So in spite of all of the free housing, the subsidized medical care, the women, infants, and children programs, despite single fathers having absolutely no access to these, but particular grants, subsidies, and benefits, single fathers do far better. Households headed by single fathers are much better off financially compared to those headed by single mothers. Single fathers also tend to be older, and again, the data is available in the article, thereby rendering them, as a result of that age, able to better impact guidance, wisdom, and experience on their young children. In fact, the only time, according to the data that we now see, when single fathers have poorer outcomes relative to single mothers is when they decide to bring in a new woman, a stepmother, or some kind of a woman in any form of partnership into the house with their children. And in those kind of scenarios, they quickly fall below the poverty line again, as you can see on screen again. When these single fathers go their own way, so to speak, and don't allow women in, single father households are a much better environment for children. And again, I'm certainly not advocating single fatherhood. I'm not advocating fatherhood, in fact, at all. It's up to you if you decide you want to have a child. But the data would suggest that if you want to do it, it's better to do it alone, either through some kind of a surrogacy agreement or through adoption. Not only will you be far better off financially, you won't have the women able to leverage the government into taking your kids and property from you. Also, in terms of the age of single fathers, and the data did kind of suggest that single fathers tend to be older. It's not just the wisdom and guidance that they impact on the young charges. It's also a genetic advantage, and I went into that in quite a bit of depth in my last video, that when you have individuals delaying the age of reproduction, so having children later on in life, possibly in the 40s or 50s for men versus the late teens, it has very, very dramatic and beneficial consequences through the effect of telomeres lengthening. Longer telomeres equate to less disease, less susceptibility to cancer, and healthier genetics passed from the progenitor to the progeny. This is really, really important here. So hopefully this was going to put an end to the often repeated idea that families are somehow essential to everything we created and we cherish. This notion is simply not backed by the facts. The family unit did not create civilization. It is not the building block of civilization. Thank you very, very much. This is CS MGTOW.